we're starting the pannier. The pannier is going to be made up of, if I can count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. You have a front piece, you have 2 side pieces which are identical, and then you have two pieces for the back. These are not going to be kept open. This is going to be seamed, but we need to keep it open, and you'll see in a little bit why we're keeping it open. Each one of these pieces has a corresponding lining, and you're not going to get these big black lines. Maybe I will actually make the lines really heavy in the pattern, but basically because I at this point didn't have a light box, I just made these lines really heavy so I could actually see through the lining fabric when I transferred the lines onto the lining fabric and with a friction. And then what I did, and I don't think it's really crucial unless you really want to, you do not need to finish the top edge of this lining. It will be exposed onto the inside of the garment, but all of these other edges are going to be captured in seams and in a turn up that we're going to do later. So what I did was I basically pinned them together, and we're just aligning them at the bottom and the sides. And of course, because I don't have a needle threaded, it's like the oldest story in the world. We're going to just do a running stitch across the top and a running stitch across the bottom, and then I will show you the next step. Now, something I didn't say in the video for the shift is that you're going to be working with linen thread. Now, linen thread, this is actually considered to be a fine quality linen thread, but it's still rather coarse. You'll see when you get your kit that you'll have not a whole spool, but you'll have some linen thread as well. This is a little bit finer, but they're both actually the same weights, and there's a slight difference to them. There's a slight, it does feel like a heavier weight. That's okay. I mean, if you really have any problems with this thread, please feel free to use whatever thread you would prefer. Linen thread is actually, it is authentic. They would have been using linen thread or silk. I mean, probably not for a linen undergarment. They wouldn't be using silk, but they'd be using linen thread, and it would have a certain coarseness to it. So we're just running a little running stitch. It's okay if you see the stitches on the other side. It actually makes it even more, I think, charming and authentic, because you're actually going to be, once this is all put together, and I'm going to show you how you do that later. Once this is all put together, we're going to be sewing tape where these lines are. We're going to be creating tape pockets, but only after we've sewn together the sides, because they're going to be continuous tape pockets. And there's a reason for that, because we're going to be running cane, like the cane that you see on some cane furniture. That's actually, we're going to be using exactly what they use for furniture. They probably used a whole bunch of different things in the 18th century. Probably cane, probably baleen or something, a whalebone, or I think baleen is from I think that's the material that strains out the krill, I think. But, you know, they used a lot of different things to keep their skirts stiff, but it generally was some sort of inserted material. When we get to that, we'll talk a little bit more about how they used to do that. But because this is a doll costume, I wouldn't say we've simplified it, but we've made it just a little bit more approachable in terms of scale and complexity, because she's a small lady. So I'm going to continue with sewing these down, again across the bottom, between the marked line and the raw edge, and across the top. Again, you can overcast this raw edge if you want. I'm not going to do it, but so we're going to do that on all of the pieces. And then we're actually going to flat fell them together. And I don't know if you remember from the video that we had done for the shift. Flat felling is basically where you sew your pieces right sides together. In this case, we're going to do it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you're going to open that up, basically press the seam open and trim one of the seam allowances short. And I'll show you on one when we get there. But basically the idea is that when these pieces are put together, you know, it might not align perfectly, but you're going to basically follow this curve when it's all together, meaning like each back, each side, and the other back, the left back, you're going to be basically doing one continuous piece of linen tape, here, and then 2 rows here, and that's what's going to use. We're going to use those as casings for our cane. So I'm going to keep working on these, and I'm not sure if I did mention it, but this linen fabric has a little bit of a stretch to it, so I starched it just to sort of stabilize it. And also it's nicer, you could also starch the linen too. It gives it a better hand, and a little bit more structure as you're working with it. So I will go off and I will continue working on this, and we'll come back and show you how to put these together. We're putting our pieces together, and we're going to flat fell them together. And we know that we did this with the shift, but I think this is a little bit different. So you basically have more layers here. When this was there was seam allowance on this side, we trimmed it close, both layers. Then we pressed it to the side, and then what we're going to do is we're going to trim away the seam allowance that's on this side. I don't know if that's really making sense, but basically we're trying to make this as, I think they call this grading. I may be completely wrong about that. Someone can correct me. But this was the seam allowance when this was open. I know, sometimes I'm not very clear. The seam allowance came out to this edge. So what I've done is I've trimmed it just the fabric side, and only up until about where the lining stops. I've trimmed that shorter. And the reason why I've done that is that I don't want there to be all of that bulk there. Sort of, it's just too much fabric to take up into that little space. I think actually this was something I think this is done with denim a lot. And you can imagine how thick denim is. And I think that they also will grade, they'll do grading with denim flat-felled seams. All the jeans and such, generally that's the way that they're finished. So I'm just basically doing the same thing, turning it over. You see, like if I had all of that additional fabric in here, it would become quite hard to turn it over. And I've used a 3/8 inch seam allowance here, not a 1/4, because it's too much to manage in such a small little area. So again, not using any pins, just basically holding it down, folding it in, holding it down, and running stitch close to the edge of the fold. So that will give you a really nice, very sturdy seam. One thing also just to mention, we don't do, I'm recommending not to do a French seam with these pieces, because you're going to be putting a linen tape where these lines are marked, and you're going to need to slide a piece of cane, like I guess it's a bamboo actually, split bamboo, inside that casing. Now if you had a French seam, you'd have this little sort of edge standing up there, and you wouldn't be able to slide anything past it, and it would be very frustrating. So that's why we're doing the flat seam, the felled seam, because it will give you a smoother a smoother channel, you won't be hitting anything as you're going through. So I'm going to just continue doing this. I'm not going to, again, waste your time with all of this stitching down. I'm not sure if I actually also mentioned that this is, I think I did mention, but this is linen thread. It's a little coarser than I think you might be used to. So, feel free. It's strong, but I think I don't think the size of our needle eyes are really made for this type of a coarse thread. So it might be a little frustrating to try to thread your needle. I can't really do it with the threader. Maybe someone who's more experienced with the threaders can, but I just find it shreds and doesn't work for me. So I just have to do it by eye. What was I going to say? But feel free to use your own thread if you're not comfortable with that. And you can see it's like just a very, very simple little running stitch you see on that side. I kind of like it. I feel like it feels like it's like an old technique before the time when people just didn't want to see any of that sort of that stitching on the surface of their garments. We see a lot of running stitches in the 18th century. So what I'm going to do now, because you can notice that all of the marks have been ironed out. You could do this with a ruler. I'm just going to basically sketch them in again. You're probably going to iron them out yet again, but you're going to just keep sort of drawing them. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect because you're just giving yourself sort of a guidance or a guideline for where you're going to place your tape. So I will, basically we're almost half of the pannier is put together. Don't look at this. This was sort of like I used a 1/4 inch seam allowance and I realized I don't have enough to turn over. So that's why I'm doing a 3/8 and it will be 3/8 in your instructions. So I will continue doing this. I will sew on the other side panel and the other back panel, and then come back to show you how we apply the tape for the channels. I think it gives you really like a very accurate silhouette using this. And so this is actually based on an extant pannier that was in Janet Arnold's book on 18th century stays and foundations, which is, if you don't have it, you should get it because there are great, great books. She's like my idol. So I'll continue doing this. I'll come back and I will show you once all of this is put together and it's all flat felled, what our next step is. So we sewed these together with a 3/8 seam allowance, our sides. We pressed it open. We trimmed off the right seam allowance pretty close, probably an 1/8 of an inch away from that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move this. This is still part of our left seam allowance. And we're going to press that down. Okay. And then we're going to actually trim this. And it might not be as much as the one beneath it. Maybe it's, I don't know, 3/16, something like that. So basically we're just sort of removing the layers and trying to make this easy enough to turn over. Now, when we get to this point, see, we only have this layer really above this. We're not going to trim very much away, really at all. So once we've done that, we're going to then press our seam allowance over towards the right. The good thing about linen is that you can do a lot with it. It's a very flexible and sturdy fabric. So I don't think I have a needle that's threaded, but maybe I do. I do. I don't have one that's knotted. Let me just give this a little knot. So it's basically the same thing that we did before, where we're turning it over and we're top stitching it close to that fold. And I'm not pinning it, just holding it in place. So I'm going to do this, as I said, I will be back when the final back piece is on and show you how we're going to start applying the tape that runs across and in these arcs and on the inside of the pannier. So all the panels have been seamed together and all flat filled, with the exception of this one, which was the kind of disaster one. But I think if you use the 3/8 inch seam allowance, you will be just fine. Don't use a 1/4 inch because it's just too bulky. So what I'm doing now is I cut linen tape. There's going to be some tape in your kit. I'm not sure if it's going to look exactly like this because this is actually, they're out of stock on this particular tape, which is really a shame because it's so pretty. But we're going to basically, just with a running stitch, sew down both edges, both of the long edges. One thing that I do want to say is that when you're doing this, you need to leave a side open. So we are going to leave the side, and you're also not going to sew it all the way to the end. So we're going to leave this side open, and we're going to leave this side open. So on the back centers, or the back sides, we're going to leave those sides open. And we're going to do the same thing when we sew down that that long strip of the linen tape, because once we've sewn this down, again, we've left those ends open. We're going to be seaming together, flat felling together, the back seam. And then we're going to be joining our tape is going to come out a little bit. We're going to be joining our tape together after we've inserted the cane. So the one thing I think that's a little bit, it's not tricky, it's just cane has like a memory to it, sort of like the millinery wire that we sometimes use that's in a coil. The cane has a memory to it too, because it's basically sold in these like coiled hanks. So when we insert it, we're just going to have to make sure that we're inserting it when the pannier is turned right side out. And I'll show you what I mean by that when we get to it. But this is just a little, a little running stitch. The cane itself is about 3.5 millimeters wide, and we'll have more than enough room to pass that through. But yeah, I think this is probably just a little bit of careful sewing, not not an exciting stitch, but you're basically just doing this running stitch. I kind of feel like it might be kind of fun, and I'm not saying you should do it unless you sort of like try it, but to use a contrasting thread so you actually see the stitches on the outside. The thing that's nice about linen is that stitches just tend to disappear in it, especially if you're using a linen thread. But I think there's something kind of fun about that kind of intentional, almost like it's a decoration. I'm not saying to do it. I'm just saying it's an idea, maybe. So I'm going to continue. Sewing. When we get to the end, the inside, the center front at this point, when we put our tape over, we are going to run over and we're going to close this edge. We want a closed edge again, and a closed side and an open side, so we can actually fit that cane in and then have something that will hold it in place, and that's going to be the closed side. So I'm going to continue to do this and come back, I think, pretty much when we're ready to do the bottom layer of tape. We're not going to insert our canes until all the tape is in place and the back seam has been flat felled closed. So I will go and I'll do that, and come back and show you what our next step is. So we have applied the curved tape and sewn it down on the top and the bottom. We've left the end facing the back side open, and then we started to apply the tape for the middle, and we've also left that open. So the idea is that once this is closed up and flat felled, we're going to then insert our cane through this. It's going to stop short here or stop here. And then we're going to insert, and then we're going to be able to insert our cane here. We might even want to just like close up this opening up to about here, because of course we have to get that cane in there first. So I might just trim that. Like here. Trim it, so we're going to just basically seam over it. Leave that open. I just started to do this to show you what this next step will be on the bottom, but we're going to turn up, or we turned up our the bottom of the pannier by about 3/16 of an inch, maybe. This doesn't do 16. Yeah, this is about 3/16. We've turned it up all the way around on the bottom, all the way across. And then we're going to apply have our tape about like 1/16 of an inch above that bottom fold. And we're going to pin that in place. We're going to do the same thing that we did with both of these. We're going to leave it open, probably about an inch from the edge. And we're going to sew it on the top and bottom. And again, leave it open an inch from the edge on the other side. And then I'm just sort of skipping around a little bit so I can show you a couple of things. And of course, my thread pulled out. Let's see here. Okay. So, excuse me, allergies. So I'll show you this on the center because it probably makes a little bit more sense. On either side, this is your waist curve. On either side of that, and up until the waist curve of the back, you're going to hem that down with a running stitch. Now, you don't need to finish the edge of that seam. It can be raw, or you can pink it, but you don't need to turn it under and sort of create a true turnover in that sense. See, yep. Just a little running stitch across there. Should really be wearing my thimble. One thing just to tell you, when you're, excuse me, working with these two materials, sometimes it can be a little difficult to pull your needle, at least for me. I don't know if it's just because of my my particular hands or my particular finger strength, but sometimes I find it helpful to use something to pull with. And I got this from Clover. It came with something. I can't remember what it came with, actually. That's interesting. But it's like a little rubber sheet that you basically wrap around your needle as you're pulling it before you pull it through or after you pull it through. And it just helps to grab it. And it gives you a little friction, I guess, like when you use a rubber glove or a rubber jar opener for those really stubborn jars that you can't seem to open on your own. So I'm just going to continue doing this. I'll do it on the other side as well. And, excuse me. And I'll move on to, so I just, again, I'm jumping around. I'll sew the bottom of this closed, just the bottom edge. Then I'll sew these two edges closed, and I'll flat fell the back. I don't think we need to probably revisit that because it's a pretty straightforward thing. And I'll hem the top of the other side. And then we'll come back and I'll show you how we insert the cane into these channels that we've made with the tape. And then just like one or two more things, and then you're pretty much done with your panniers. These panniers can actually be made even wider if you want. I sort of chose a sort of an in-between size because some of her skirts are quite wide, but you know, she would not always have been wearing wide skirts during this time period, during the like 1740s through the 1760s. They would have sort of been narrower, wider, excuse me, according to the occasion. So you could see, especially in Jenna Arnold's book and some other costume books, you'll see just massive, massive, massive panniers for wedding gowns, for court gowns. I mean, they're just kind of crazy. And I even recall seeing some that just really looked like a woman was walking around in the middle of a sofa because they were so wide and there wasn't really any fullness. It was just kind of hilarious, but they were beautifully, beautifully embroidered. So I will continue doing this. I will be back and we will talk about inserting the canes. So I'm just going to do a little quick overview of us closing the center back seam closed, or sewing it closed. We want to make sure that we pin back our loose or open linen tape. We don't want to catch it up in that seam, and we're doing that on both sides. And we're just going to do this with again, with a tight running stitch. You know, if you want, you can do, if you really want this to be super strong and last until Kingdom Come, you could always do this with a back stitch. But I think if you sort of just did it with like a running stitch and then you took a back stitch, oh, can't stand that. Every few stitches, it'll just keep it strong. This isn't going anywhere. Okay, so I'm going to, just for the sake of my sanity, I'm going to take these pins out. I'm just going to keep going up. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did with the other seams. We're going to iron the seam allowance open. We're going to cut the seam allowance on the, on the right hand. We're going to then grade the seam allowance on the left hand. We're going to fold that seam allowance over and sew it with a running stitch close to the folded line. And then we're going to insert our first piece of cane. Before I do this, though, I'm going to just go and look to see if I can quickly grab. In your kit, you're going to have a much thinner 1/8-inch thick piece of linen tape. And I think it probably makes sense for you to do this at this point, and I want to be very clear about it. You're going to be cutting, how many are there here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You're going to be cutting 8 of these. These are ties, and they're going to be approximately 6.5 inches. These are ties that are going to be sewn to the inside of the pannier. Now, the reason why they're being sewn to the inside of the pannier is that they're going to be very much like, I think if you recall in some 1870s gowns, there are tapes inside that might be tied together to provide a little bit more control over the fabric. But what we're going to do, and it doesn't matter if it's at the top and the bottom, I think probably I will do it at the top. We're going to be sewing one here, and we're going to be sewing one here. We're going to be sewing one here, and on the other side, in exactly those same places, they're marked with X's in your pattern. I've actually done this. I want to make sure that we're not sewing it, or you want to make sure that you're not sewing it onto or in the middle of that tape. You want to sew it above because you might make sure that the cane can pass through and there's nothing obstructing it. But we're going to do that while this is inside out. I actually had done that when it was all finished, and it's just too much, you have to turn it inside out and you're working with the canes and it's a little, once the cane is in there, it has a structure that's kind of makes it a little bit bouncy. So you're just going to want to do that first. And hopefully I'll remember to make that revision in the instructions. But by doing this, we're going to actually tie a knot in one end, and we're actually going to tie a knot in the other end too. So, there's no real trick to that. Like, if you really want it to be totally, I want to say anal, but it's not really being anal, it's just being careful. You could also cut it a little bit longer. You'll have enough. I was going to say you could also dip this in a little glue or touch it with a little glue to keep it together. Again, I don't think if you tie in a tight knot, that's not going to go anywhere. We're tying a knot on the other end because we want to have something which is strong that we can sew into. So we're going to be sewing into that knot, again, above the tape, not on the tape. We want to make sure that we're not, again, obstructing the cane when it goes through. So we're just going to keep doing this. Probably will stop and come back when we've inserted our first piece of cane. The first piece of cane we're going to insert is going to be these curved sides, because remember, we're going to insert it in here, then we're going to close this up, and then we're going to insert this one as well. But you'll see, I'll do that on one of them before in the next step, so you can see how that works. But first we have to flat fell, close up, flat fell the back, center back seam, sew on our little 1/8 inch tapes. Make sure that we're really carefully knotting some of these things off. Okay. You probably could take the pins out at this point. You haven't sewn anything together, and we're just going to use our little press board here. And open up our seam allowance. You could press over this if you don't want to have a wrinkle there. Just press it all the way to the top, and then again, the grading and the trimming and the flat felling, which I will not need to show you again. But I think you can sort of see what we're talking about here, where we have a little bit of extra, and that extra is going to be sewn down. First of all, we're going to turn it over. Imagine this is flat felled, and we're going to turn this over. And we're going to, of course, this is going to be here. I should really trim that. I'll trim it right now. Okay. Once that's flat felled again, you're just going to fold these over until they approximately meet. And I would not do this until after the cane is in the pocket, because you want to make sure you have enough room to maneuver that, and also making sure you have enough room to just at least cover that, because I can see it's not gonna, nothing bad will happen if you don't have that overlap. You just want to make sure that you close it up at the end. So let me continue to work on this flat fell, and then we'll be back and show you the first 2 pieces of cane. And you'll also see that we'll have sewn on our little tapes for bringing in the fullness of the panniers. So the back has been closed with the flat felled seam, and before we turned this inside out, we actually created this little channel for a drawstring. We're going to run a piece of string through this. That'll be probably the very last thing we do, but we start to insert the hoops, or the canes rather. This is not a hoop skirt. So when I sort of said that this material has a memory, notice how it's sort of like curving in on itself, and this smoother side, I guess you'd say, the sort of like the shellac side, is the side that we're going to want to put into the channel. Now, this is going to be the only time we're going to have to try to finagle around one of the felled seams. The rest of them should really slide really easily because you're going to be putting it in from the side. Well, you're going to be putting it in from the opening where there is where the felled seams are sort of facing away from it, so it should glide over. So we're just, you're just sort of pulling this in. It should go in pretty easily. You've got more than enough room. Before you actually had pushed it in, and I'll show you on the next one what I mean. Excuse me. You're just going to clip this, and it doesn't have to be, there's no particular length for this. You just don't want it to interfere with the other channel that you're going to be making. Excuse me. Goodness. You're going to sort of take the end of this, and you're kind of just going to, it's not really rounding it. It's just sort of like chamfering it so you don't have any really sharp points that are going to snag onto anything. And let me just see here. So in this case, because all of these have been felled to the, I guess, the right, we're going to be going into this from the left to the right. And so it should really, it should really slide in with like no obstruction at all. You're going to have to go around corners and rather around curves, but you just simply gently feed it through, and this is going to be quite a long piece of cane. Obviously, you're not going to need all of this, but you're just going to keep feeding it through. You just don't want to make sure you're not breaking it, and this is pretty pliable. You're just going to keep going through. You probably can't see anything I'm doing here, but you're just going to keep feeding it and feed it past the center front. You don't want it gathered up onto the cane. You want it to be the fabric to be perfectly flat around this. Oh, you could also see where I've attached the cords. So again, there's going to be 2 cords on each side of this, on the front and the back. And those will show you how those are going to be used after. Pretty much that's the last thing we're going to do. So we're just going to keep feeding this through. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think you're seeing anything on camera, but I think you get the idea. Okay. It's just it's a little fiddly, but just with some patience, you're going to get there. You just keep going. Okay, we're almost at the back opening. I think we are. Yep, I can see it. So we're almost at the back opening. You're just going to keep sort of feeding it through. Feeding it through. Come on, let's go. We'll have all day. Okay. Okay, and you can actually see where the cord is, where the cane is starting. So that's a good thing. Okay. So now we can sort of just like smooth this out. Now that we know this cane is coming out, we just want to probably like at least an inch or an inch and a half to work with. This is probably too much, but this is what I'm going to show you. We want to slip that cane into the other side of the channel. Now this one we want to do the same thing with. We want to cut it, and we want to slip it behind. So this one, let me just look at this for a second. So this one I think is going over. This one's going under. So I just, again, make sure that, you don't have any gathering around here. And then what you're going to do, and again, it's a little fiddly, but you just have to sort of work with it. You're just going to make sure that the cane is sort of caught up. And you know, on this one, I think we probably could have cut it a little bit shorter on this side, on the arc one. I think I'll probably cut this a little bit shorter. Okay. So really the thought behind this is that you want to capture all of the cane and the cut ends of your arc ribbon or linen tape inside the overlapping tape. So what I'm going to do, because I think it'll probably make it easier, I'm going to, and this one you're going to probably have to do with a stab stitch because you've already closed this and now there's sort of like a curve to this. It makes it a little bit harder to work with. Not impossible, but you know, you just have to finagle it. Okay. I'm probably gonna just kind of like, you know, working it into place. I actually can feel a little bit of that cane there. Just want to make sure that when I do go over it, I'm going over it, not through the cane. Okay, so that's probably good enough. What we're going to do, and I can zhuzh that a little bit more, but what we're going to do is we're going to sew that first down, and we're going to sew it with a stab stitch around the top. I'll show you, of course. I don't have a threaded needle, or at least not enough in that needle. Let's see here. This one's going to be tricky. It's, you know, sometimes this linen thread actually starts to separate like this one. If it does, you just clip, have a new fresh end, and there you go. Okay. So what I'm doing here, you're going to do exactly at the bottom edge. You're going to do the same exact thing by feeding it around and then overlapping it a little bit. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit here. I'll get my thimble. Okay. Now, you know, I do want to try to catch the raw edge of that curving piece. I don't know if you can see any of this. Okay. Yep. And I want to catch the raw edge of this, so I'm going to take this and I'm going to tuck it down. There we go. And as usual, I'm going fast, so I do apologize. This should really be done fairly slowly and thoroughly, but I think you get the gist of what we're trying to do here. Basically, just enclosing that cane within the back. I'm going to go back and I'm going to neaten that other side, but I just want to continue on with this one. Okay. So our cane is pretty much captured already, but what we're going to do is we're going to, let's see, we're going to take down, we're going to make sure that we capture it at the bottom so it's encased. Then we're going to take this free edge, we're going to fold it under, and we're just, you're going to neaten that up a little bit. You're going to fold that under, and you're just going to sew it, slip stitch it closed. So it should really be sewn closed across this line and across this line, so everything is like stable. Now the reason why we cross the canes is that we want a little rigidity here. We have rigidity in the front because there's not two pieces of cane in there. There's just one piece. You can also see it sort of taking shape here, that really kind of interesting 18th century shape. So I'm going to finish this up, and then I'm going to come back, and the last two things we're going to be doing, once we've got the cane in the bottom row, and we have everything sewn up, we're going to be, let's just make sure that we're tightening this up a little bit. We are going to be putting in a drawstring, and then we are going to be gathering the tops of the side panels, because that's what really creates that sort of basket. It's already a basket shape, but that's what creates the sort of the basket, like the body of the basket, so to speak, is in these side pieces. So I think you can sort of see how that's coming together. Again, not entirely happy with that. Let's see what we can do about that to make it a little bit tighter. And you don't even need all of this. You don't even need all of this. You can even cut that a little shorter. I think you probably just want to make sure that you've got a nice enough overlap. And I think it probably would be nice just to have the overlap be at that center seam, just to make it feel as neat as possible. Yeah. So I'm going to continue to sew, close this up. And I'm going to just bring my thread up here. It's okay, it's all being tucked behind. And kind of tricky to work inside of something, but you're going to get a much better result if you insert the cane from the inside rather than from having the piece inside out and then turning it inside out, because it just will kind of be a little wonky. You want you want to use that shape of the cane, the memory of the cane, to your advantage. And then, I'm just going to tuck this up here. Now, there are canes in there. We don't really have to worry about that. I don't want it to be tucked in that much. Maybe about that. And then tuck this in a little bit. Maybe I've already stitched it in, so that's okay. So I'm going to try to get it in there. Okay. And since there's cane behind this, I might just do like a little bit of a slip stitch to close this last little piece here. Not going to go anywhere. And then maybe a little bit of a slip stitch here, or whip these two edges together. It's not really a whip, I guess, but just closing up the opening. Okay. Okay, and that could be neater, but for the sample, I think it's probably fine. So again, you can see this sort of this bounciness, you know, like that's what's creating the shape, the basket of this piece. Now, I am going to finish by putting the cane at the bottom, and I'm going to close that up, and then I'm going to come back and show you these other steps. But just to sort of show you the purpose of these, well, it's probably going to be a little difficult to show you without having the cane, because what these are doing is they're actually tying or bringing in the depth of this, and you're going to do the same thing on the top with the top ones. And you see how that's basically creating this more narrow sort of, I don't know, oblong pill shape. That's what we're trying to get. The skirts of this time were they were not very deep. They were rather shallow. They were very wide, but they weren't very deep. It's not like, you know, in the 1860s where you had a perfectly round circumference of skirt. You were trying to make this sort of a narrow, this narrow shape. So that's what those, and it will work even better when that cane is in, because it needs to have sort of something rigid that it's tying it together with. So I will continue to do that and then come back and show you the drawstring and how we're going to gather up these side pieces. Everything's been closed up inside. And what we're doing now, I'll show you on this side because it probably will be a little clearer. Starting at the side seam and ending at the other side seam, we're going to start to, and using a double thread for strength, we're just basically doing a sort of a whipped gathering stitch along the top of that seam. And what we're basically doing is we're pulling in all of that width into a tinier area. So if you can sort of see what that's doing, it's creating that little shelf that sort of that's your basket shape, the top of your basket. And once we've done that, we really just want to make sure that we're tying that off as securely as possible. And we're using a double thread because we don't want it to break. We don't want those stitches to come loose. You know, when this style was actually, originally worn, sometimes they actually had separate sort of inner pockets in the sides of these. I don't really know how a lady would access them because she was wearing her skirt. She already had pockets that would be hanging in front, which is what Denise will be taking you through. But they used to sort of like just, they were able to drop things in here. So imagine like you had two little side bags here. It's kind of funny. So the next to last thing that we're going to do that on both sides. And I've only done it on one side, and you can see how much fullness you're actually pulling up in there. We're going to create a drawstring. And the way we're doing this is we're taking the twine that's in your kit and just a little bit away, and it has to be a blunt needle like you would use for crewel work. And we're going to feed that, start from the center back, a little bit away from the center back. And we're going to feed that through the front, or through the one half of the back, through the front. And it should go pretty easily through there. Just make sure you don't pull it out on that side. You're using probably about an 18-inch length of string or twine. Actually, I think this is sort of like a natural sisal twine, at least I hope it is. That's what I've always used it for, sometimes for like small piping and things like that. You might want to then sort of even it out here. And what I like to do is I like to just tie a knot on the ends, just so it's not going to go anywhere. Or see how it's already fraying on that end? You just want to keep it just neat and orderly. That's not all that we do for the waistband. So when you have inserted your waistband, you made sure it's even on both sides. You're going to sew it, sew that twine inside the channel at the very center of the front. The reason why we're doing this is that we don't want that twine to go anywhere. We don't want it to pull out. We want to have a little bit of resistance when we're tying it around Belinda's waist. And just make sure you're sort of going through that. I think I'm probably going a little overboard here, but just to give you the idea of what we're doing. Okay. Then really, besides gathering this other side, really the last thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be tying in the sides of this. And, you can do it from the top. And you might do it a couple of times. You might want to see what shape you think is working the best. I sort of feel like it could be a little bit narrower at the top, and we're doing the bottom now, than at the bottom, because the skirt could possibly flare out a little bit. I'm not sure if I really mind that. That's sort of like that little scoop that's happening there, or I might want it to be just a little bit looser on the bottom. Let's see. These things are long enough where you can sort of play with it. Yeah, I think there's something happening there that's working. So once we've gathered this side, we're going to put this on Belinda, and we're going to draw up the waistband as like this. So when she's stepping into it, there's enough room for her to get into this without any issues. And then I think we're pretty much done. So I hope that you have fun with this. I think this is a really interesting undergarment, and it's just really, like, to me, symbolic of this of women's fashion in this century. It's something you don't really see happen again. It was very unique for its time. There were, sort of like farthingales and other things before this, but they were more round or sort of like drum-like. This was the first time you had this sort of strange side width, and I just think it's very special and very interesting how fashion has looked to define women's bodies. Either very, very wide skirts or bustles exaggerating their behinds. I think it would be interesting. I would love to see if there's anything in the written record of contemporary women from this time, basically talking about their experiences wearing panniers. I think that I've read some about the stays, about sort of comments about stays and such, but not really about panniers. So if there's anything out there, I would love to know about it, because I would love to brush up on or not even brush up, just be informed and educated about this particular time period that I really think is just so fascinating. So have fun with these panniers. Make them out of different fabrics. They would have had them out of, figured, probably a little later, figured cotton, silk for very, very fancy ones, damask for very fancy. As I said, feel free to experiment with the width. You could even split this pattern up and make just two side panniers. So this would actually be closed on the sides, and those would just basically be worn on the side of the hips. And that's something that you're going to see kind of much later in the 18th century, when the skirts are becoming a little bit less crazily wide, and probably just more practical to get in and out of than these huge something that with this width. So I'm going to keep playing with this until I sort of find the shape that I want, And I hope you have fun with this, and I would love to see what you make. Thank you.
Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button.